I'm Greg Forster with the American Academy of Sciences and Letters, and today I'm interviewing Academy member Dan Asia, who has just gone to emeritus status recently at the University of Arizona, where he's taught for a very long time, and is also the president of Polyhymnia. Dan, thank you so much for being with us.
A pleasure.
What would you say are one or two challenges that you see to maintaining high intellectual standards in your field?
My field, for those who don't know me, is music, composition, uh, contemporary classical music more generally. I'm known both as a composer, conductor, educator, and for the last 15 years or so, writer. But I'm also engaged more broadly in the field of the arts. So the arts, as I'm sure our listeners will know, are not particularly strong right now. There have been periods in our history, perhaps the Rococo period would be the best example between the Baroque and the Classical period, where one could say there was a wonderful music written, wonderful art created, but perhaps not at the height of either the previous or the period that followed thereafter. Why is this? The appearance of genius is mercurial, and you don't know when it's going to happen or where it's going to happen. Having said that, we know some of the conditions for it. That includes support for it, either by aristocrats or by merchants or mercantilists. It can also be in totalitarian regimes where and capitalist societies because genius is not held back by any sort of economic restraints. Having said that, so let me speak specifically about the problems here in the United States, and I would say I'll see if I then have a chance to broaden it to other countries. The arts have been completely politicized in our country. That didn't work particularly well for the Soviet Union or for the Soviet bloc, Shostakovich aside, and a few other minor composers. Refer to my aforementioned comments. But the problem with the politicization of the arts is that art, in my estimation, should be first and foremost about beauty. If we can assume that goodness, truth, and beauty are important characteristics in the world, then beauty is one of that triumvirate. So we have a problem when beauty is demoted in the service of politics, and politics becomes more important. Occasionally, agitprop can produce something of interest, again, because the person who produces it is a genius, but it's rare. When politics overrides aesthetic values, it usually means that aesthetic values are therefore decreased, and that's a problem. So this has happened in the visual arts, it's happened in the musical arts, it's happened probably in dance as well. So that has to do with the aesthetic matters in regards to my area, the arts generally. Um, Now, the problem with the politics is that people are driven out of it. In other words, if you hold meetings at the beginning of a production and everybody's supposed to give their pronouns, and everybody knows that, in fact, if you are not a left political person, you will probably not get a job or be derided, then we're back to the blacklisting during the McCarthy age. Now, those on the left seem to think that since they hold the upper hand and their ideology is, of course, the truth, it's okay. Not only okay, it is to be welcomed. This is a major problem for us in music. Of course, if you decide that you should only be playing the music or presenting the artwork by Blacks, Latinas, gays, lesbians, and those under 35, when in the past we have derided ageism, and any form of discrimination, but only wish to raise aesthetic value, then you have a problem. You will drive people from the theaters, you'll drive them from the museums, and you'll drive them from the concert halls because they will realize that what they're listening to and seeing is drivel. And unfortunately, we are now in the age of drivel. You'll excuse me. Now, most of our audiences don't know the difference. That's a problem for us. That's another problem because the lack of existence of arts education in our schools for the last 40 years has given us an audience that are formed of know-nothings. They have no idea what artistic content is. They have no real sense of what an emotional response should in fact be to great music or to great art because they haven't experienced it. So like a religious experience, if you've never had one, you don't know what it's supposed to be. If you've never seen great art and been able to respond to it, not all people can, by the way, but most can. But if you haven't experienced, it's hard to know what that experience is and how to develop it. And that, unfortunately, requires education, just like elevation of our souls and our intellect in any intellectual art form does as well.
And it's
Um,
similar to other areas. You know, if you don't learn math when you're in school, you can learn it later, but you probably won't.
it
And
is
similarly,
unlikely. It is unlikely. You know, we had a period in the 50s and the 60s, which the great now deceased critic Terry Teachell called the middlebrow period. You may have heard that term. What does it describe? People actually wanted to better themselves. You know, they went to concerts, they bought records to listen to records, they read the great books, they participated in study sessions. We've now become an entertainment culture where we move from basketball to football to women's basketball to baseball now to betting online to games. And the idea of, in fact, working to improve ourselves intellectually, and I include the arts in that, of course, that doesn't seem to be something that we prize in our culture.
you know, on the bookshelf behind me, I still have the 2.5 feet or more of Harvard classics, which my grandfather bought for my mother when my mother was a baby from a door-to-door salesman who knocked on the door. And my grandfather sat there in his living room with my mother as a baby on his knees, and the salesman talked to him about how he would want to have the great books in his home. If he was going to raise a child. And I've still got them here, but that aspirational culture does seem to have collapsed. This brings me to my next question. So, since we're already talking
Yeah.
about this, I'm going to ask the next question. What do you think the mission of the university ought to be, and why is it important?
The universities historically have had various missions. We can start with those in Germany and then in this country, where they were primarily religious institutions to teach those who were going to become pastors. So they were certainly, we could say, educating the soul, or their mission was to educate the soul and to produce people of wisdom or on the road to wisdom. After World War II, they became part of the military industrial complex, which wasn't the leftist term, by the way. It was Dwight Eisenhower who said, look, I ran the goddamn army. Excuse my French. There I go, Greg. And said, look, I know the dangers of these large institutions. And they can overwhelm a democracy. So universities then took on a scientific aspect funded by the government. We're dealing with this question right now of how to deal with this. Um, but they became scientific institutions primarily, or that overtook what had been a humanistic enterprise by and large. The sciences were part of that. Don't forget, the sciences came out of philosophy. So they were part of a desire to understand the world better. Now, as part of that, I just want to backtrack so that people understand with the quadrivium and the trivium. I mean, the most important things were rhetoric and music, the ability to speak, the ability to argue cogently, the ability to transcend ourselves through the beauty of music, and art only then followed in music's footsteps. Music was the art of the spheres. It's what connected us to our souls and to God and to the universe. So I digress just slightly. So what happened after World War II? Universities essentially were taken over by the sciences because that's where all the money came from. The humanities were at least somewhat on an equal footing. The social sciences came in. That terminology, by the way, is, I think, suspect. Uh, is there really such a thing as social science? The social sciences would like us to think that, in the same way that economists would like to call themselves a science. What's the term for it? Is it the dirty science or the
The
perverted
dismal.
science?
Dismal is the
The
traditional
dismal,
term.
thank you. The dismal science. Yes, the dismal science. Okay, but a science, there it is. And students would come. Why did they come to the university? They came, one, because they were qualified, which is to say they had succeeded at a high level in their high schools and they were ready to undertake high level studies at the very beginning of their college careers in all areas of study, which were rather prescribed, by the way. In other words, there were no such things as gender studies, as African American studies, as women's studies. You had things like English, you had history, philosophy, economics, what I will call serious fields of study, musicology, etc. Students did serious studying, were expected to study 20 hours, 30 hours a week. That was their job. Now students come to the university unprepared. Most of them have to take remedial work. They're not capable of thinking logically. They're not capable of writing. They can take courses in home economics, in essence. They can take courses in gen ed, like the history of hallucinogenics, rather than history one, history two, social science one, economics one, etc., which has real content to it. They can skate through at the taxpayer's benevolence, essentially learning very little. Now, I haven't focused on one other thing. Universities at that time were generally equally divided between those on the left and those on the right, or probably more balanced or towards those to the moderate liberals and on the right. Universities in the last 60 years, since the 60s, have been taken over by the radicals that Roger Kimball talks about in his book, The Tenured Radicals. They have instituted courses in a philosophy of critical race theory and Marxism, which has created our new elite class in their 30s and 40s who are fundamentally anti-American and now anti-Semitic, as was shown to us after the outbreaks of anti-Semitism across the United States after October 7th. Now our intellectual elite seems to think that terrorists are wonderful and that America at its heart is now fundamentally an evil country which is to be traduced. So universities, of course, need to get back to their mission. They need to reduce their bureaucratic staff, which has taken over the university, which has caused prices to rise so that most people come out of universities now with over $100,000 in debt. That never occurred before 25 years ago. It should be rolled back completely, and 3/4 of our administrators should be fired. And as Secretary of Education McMahon stated, university presidents need to regain their positions of stature, and not just bureaucrats and not just fundraisers, but understand that they are fundamentally in charge of an educational institution. A business it is, but it's business as education, and it's producing a product that is not appropriate for this country, they better take care of it.
Now that you have emeritus status, you can call for three-quarters of the administrative staff to be fired. It's
Oh,
dangerous to give.
I was calling for this long before because we couldn't hire faculty, but we'd increased the number of people in our administration.
I believe it. I'm joking around with you. Well,
Yeah, yeah.
Alan Bloom once said the modern university can split the atom, compile dictionaries of dead languages, and survey hundreds of millions of people and find out what they think, but it cannot design a coherent program of undergraduate education.
No, it
And
cannot.
yeah, because it for the reasons you've mentioned, I think massive subsidies for research have been at best a double-edged sword. They have reoriented the incentives, and uh, that's why we're working on holding up something that has to do with both citizenship and the soul. Let me ask you, since we're already talking about my next question, my last
Yeah.
question, and that's the how the public at large understands the mission of the university. In what ways do you think the public at large has a good understanding of the mission of the university? In what ways does it not?
I'm going to reformulate the question just a tad, if you don't mind. I think the question might that might be better to ask it. It's just a slight change. Is what does the public think is actually happening in the university according to what they think the mission of a university is? I'm not one who's particularly in favor of mission statements because they're usually bland, boulderized nonsense, right? Oh, we'll do good for the world. Do good for the city, the state, the country, and the global community. I don't know what a global community is, though. You have to describe that to me. But every university says that now that or they're working at a global level. I'd like to know what the University of Arizona is doing in South Africa and the Sudan and Yemen. Are they involved with the Houthis and trying to stop the Houthis from shooting missiles at Israel? I'd love to know how many are involved in that global problem. So here's the problem. I think most of our electorate, most of our concerned citizens, I would say up until COVID in regards to K through 12, and then up until October 7th, in regards to curriculum and philosophy and anti-Semitism on our universities, I think they were completely unaware of what had in fact happened to our institutions of education. I think the universities have been very good at that. I think K through 12 teachers have been very good at that, which is to say, our students have been now indoctrinated at every level from K through 16. I don't think that our citizenry understands it. I think they are now waking up to it. I think they realize the impact that these ideologies that were being taught now have had on our society. And I think you are seeing that now being played out in our politics right now, whether it's in the demonstrations against federal buildings in Portland, whether it's the possibility of the first democratic socialist, why don't we just call him socialist mayor of New York? And why is this happening? It's because of indoctrination. And it's because nobody has been taught history for the last 40 years. And nobody knows, therefore, they don't really know about the history of communism in the Soviet Union. They certainly have never heard of Pol Pot in Cambodia. They probably think that Chairman Mao was just a sweet old man who didn't murder 60 million people.
And if they did know about those things, they probably would not be equipped to make the connections to things that are happening now.
Correct. They would not be able to understand that, in fact, ideas when executed in various realms of human activity, actually bear certain kind of fruit, and that there are trade-offs. You want a socialist society, then you will not have freedom. You will have less freedom. Now, they've never studied the notions of freedom. They've never really studied the Declaration of Independence. They've never really looked at the Federalist Papers. I can assure you, this is a generation of ignoramuses who don't know anything. Our forefathers, when they set up the country, said, this needs to be an engaged, literate, intellectual citizenry. That was part of the understanding, which is why, of course, Benjamin Franklin famously said, yes, you have a republic. Now, can you keep it? Well, we're coming up against that question right now in our own time because we're dealing with a literate that one is ignorant, anti-intellectual, is anti-religious, but not just anti-religious. They're essentially anti-moral. They don't know what morality is, and they have no sense of themselves as human beings with a soul. You can't really use the word in academia, soul. You'd be laughed at. We, of course, do in our class, though. It seems to me that in education, we in fact need to go back to the beginning of universities, which in fact, they are places to educate the soul and to teach our young that in fact there is a civilization of which they are a part, that is a long-standing one. And even though science only started 150 years ago, guess what? There was great wisdom in other areas, philosophy and a religion that tells us about who we are as human beings. And that this is as important to us as any scientific understanding that we can relate to our students. Polyhymny, the organization in which I'm president, which began as the Center for American Culture and Ideas at the University of Arizona, does a number of things. It promotes the notion that the high arts are the fine arts, which means visual art, dance, music, and the traditions of those, which in the case of music are, of course, 2,000 years old. For visual art, probably 30,000 years old, and for dance, it's the newest, back to Louis XIV, to the 1600s. Fair enough. But in fact, that might be important for our students rather than learning about Taylor Swift or the Beatles. But there's something more important about Bach and Beethoven. I don't care if they like it or not right now, by the way, or if they like Goya or if they like Rembrandt. They need to know it. Why? As I tell my students or told my students, look, 60% of you aren't going to get this. 20% of you are going to get it. The other 20% aren't going to show up for class or they're going to flunk. The 60% of you who don't get it or only get a little bit of it, what I'm hopeful of is that in 20 years, you're going to a museum and a concert, and you're going to say, oh, that's what that jerk Asia was trying to teach me 25 years ago.
You know,
Because
I,
education isn't for,
you know,
yeah, education isn't for its time now. It's 4 years, it's for a student's entire life.
I used to say Aristotle doesn't really begin to speak to people until they're 30, but recently I've been thinking I need to revise that upward because people are maturing more late. But eventually Aristotle will begin to speak to you. And Plato tells us that what Socrates was talking to people about was their souls. And that in many ways is the root of our
Exactly.
traditions in the university. Dan, thank you so much for being with us. We really appreciate your taking the time.